am going to be talking a little bit today about apologizing, saying I'm sorry. I think we've moved into this age of I don't need to apologize for being me, kind of thing, that I'm good enough and I don't owe you an apology and I'm going to be who I am, and that kind of a little bit of arrogance and narcissism and the egocentrism that goes along with some of those attitudes that I am who I am and you should love me the way I am, which everybody's worthy of love. We've deserved that love since birth. But some of the entitlement and the treatment that we attribute to being loved and worthy isn't necessarily earned all the time. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. We don't all live in a vacuum and we do impact each other. And the first thing that is not healthy to apologize for is vulnerability and apologizing for how we feel. We do not ever need to apologize for how we feel. It's okay to have the thoughts and feelings that we have. It's the behaviors that we have control of, how we act out those feelings. And that's what we're responsible for. It's really important that we not apologize for feeling the way we feel, and we never need to apologize for being vulnerable, because it takes so much courage to show our emotions, to speak honestly about how we feel. In doing that, that's where intimacy comes from. The next part is crying, any show of vulnerability. We don't need to apologize for crying, and we do not need to shame our children for crying. Now, that does not mean that we enable people who cry. When they cry, then finally we give in and say, okay, you can have what you want. But to be able to empathize with someone who is crying and empathize and be there for someone who is upset. And one thing that's also happened in our culture is when people just show displays of emotion, we tend to back off. And you see in television, the glamorization of being cold and emotionally removed has become the norm. There are elements of this that are survival skills, but there are pieces of it that's the emotional intelligence that allows us to make healthy decisions on our own and on others' behalves. And so this idea of shaming someone for crying, or when someone's emotional, saying, oh, you need some space over there, as opposed to being able to sit with them and say, I can see you're upset. Same with feelings like anger. When someone's angry, to be able to sit with them and actually validate their feelings, they're much more likely to calm down pretty quickly. One thing that we do not need to apologize for being selfish. We have to take care of ourselves before we can even be of service to other people. And again, that does not mean that we live in a vacuum. And it does not mean that it is okay to be selfish 100% of the time, because the reality is we are a social world where we rely on people, and some of that does mean it's important to be considerate of other people's feelings and be understanding of our relationship with the world around us and the people around us. But there's a lot of shame culture, especially for parents, especially for individuals who have aging parents. That idea that you're abandoning your kids, or you're abandoning your elderly parents, or you're abandoning your partner by asking for alone time. And the reality is, and what the research has shown us, is that the parents who take that time alone and take good care of themselves, they work out, or they have some kind of self-care habit, are actually much better partners and parents and caregivers, because they have the energy and have more to offer. One thing we don't need to apologize for is not knowing the answers. We don't know the answers. Most of us don't know much about anything. If we were all really to get down to it, we don't always know all the answers to everything. And it's okay to not know everything and to not be an expert at everything. When it comes to your work, when it comes to parenting, when it comes to knowing what the best life choice is to make next, or what road you need to take in your transition in life, we don't know. Nobody knows. And the reality is, there is no right answer or wrong answer for you. Oftentimes, we're shamed for having made certain choices in the past. Think about it. Obviously, if you knew you had better options, you truly knew, and based on your experiences and your information, wouldn't you have taken it? Yes, we all would have. We would obviously, if we had all the information right there at the tip of our fingers, we would obviously go with the right or the best answer. We don't. And so you're doing the best you can, and you don't need to apologize when you make mistakes. And the last one that I had in my notes was having higher expectations. It's funny, this actually came up in one of my groups this week. There's a lot of shame over setting boundaries. And I think it is so important for you to feel confident in your ability to say no, set boundaries, and to say, honestly, when something's not good enough. It's not good enough. Either how you're treating me is not good enough, the food I'm eating is not good enough, the lifestyle or the amount of free time I'm getting right now is not good enough, how much I'm being paid is not good enough. Anytime you're having a sensation that something is not good enough, I want you to really trust it. One thing you do not need to apologize is for having high expectations for yourself. It is very important to hold on to those because that's your self-worth is tied to that. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be reasonable, and I think it is important to have appropriate expectations and to tease some of that out, but you don't need to apologize for wanting more for yourself. So the one thing that I wanted to end on was sometimes we do need to apologize, you know? And it's not that we have to. You don't ever have to apologize. You are not a bad person if you don't apologize. But it is something that we have found is helpful for having relationships. To be able to give an apology, it's not admitting submission, which is what our culture has sometimes equated it with, that you are submitting to some form of dominance, that, hey, you're more dominant, I'm submitting that I am wrong and humbling myself before you. It's not that. The point of apologies are connection. The root of when someone needs an apology or some kind of connection, what they're really needing is for you to simply acknowledge their feelings and, again, vulnerability, that you care about them. Okay? And so part of giving an apology is recognizing that you do not have to be right, or they don't have to be right, in order for some kind of communication to happen that shows empathy and love for the other person's feelings. So the second thing is acknowledging what you did that hurt the other person's feelings. It is so important that we're able to say, when I turned off your music, I can imagine it looked like I was just blowing you off. It is not a reflection of how I feel, and I am so sorry for that. What you're doing is you're acknowledging their experience. Even though your experience was different. My experience was I was just walking through, didn't like the song, turned off music, right? His experience was like, screw her. I'm not sorry for turning off music, honestly. I am so sorry for giving any kind of impression that I don't respect my husband. Does that make sense? What's happening for their experience isn't just that you turned off the music or just that you made a few comments. It's all the stuff that's underneath it, because humans have a lot of depth. And so when we're giving an apology or when we're working out something with regards to someone else's feelings being hurt, it's so important that we get out of the tit for tat, get out of the details, and go straight for the feelings. Does that make sense? And to be able to identify the other person, what you did, what your actions were that were never intended to hurt them. The next part is saying buts. I'm sorry, but. Anytime you catch yourself saying but, you're not acknowledging the person's feelings. You're trying to be right. The whole point of even having a conversation when you're frustrated with one another is connection, right? Is to reconnect, to heal. And so anytime we say but, just know that's not going to help the problem. So catch yourself. One thing I usually coach people on is learning to say and instead of but. To say and at the same time, and it automatically changes the attitude a little bit in the conversation. So that's one recommendation if you find yourself doing that a lot. It's hard. It's a habit. The last part, this is the hardest part. One thing we go into an apology with is the expectation that they are going to heal right then and there, and they're going to forgive us right away. The river often runs much deeper than that individual circumstance. So again, I turn the music off on my husband. He thinks I'm being rude and disrespectful and dismissive of his needs. What's underneath all of that is a history of someone maybe actually being inconsiderate of his needs, or people blowing him off, or whatever that is. Again, I'm making this circumstance up, but just for the sake of giving an example, there's so much deeper than that. And so what happens is, just like when we feel hurt, it's kind of comparable to an open wound that hasn't fully healed, even though all you did really was just a bump, but it opened up that wound that's already been there for a long time. And so sometimes I've heard myself say this, like, I apologized. Why can't you get over this? What has to happen is our ability, and this is emotional intelligence and our maturity. It takes our maturity to be able to do this. And it takes some courage to be able to sit with that and walk away. And if they're not ready to forgive us, or they're not feeling good about it yet, they still need time to process our apology. Forgiving us and accepting our apology has to be on their time. We've got to give that to them. That is it for today. I hope that was helpful. If you guys have any other thoughts about this, please continue the conversation. I always check back in. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Thank you guys for jumping on board, and I will see you next Wednesday. Bye. Mwah.